Ever been to a party so wild it made you question reality? Well, ancient Romans threw parties that would make Vegas look like a Sunday school picnic. Today, these antics would land you in jail, or at least very aggressively canceled, but back then it was just another Tuesday. So buckle up, because today we are diving into the ridiculous, over-the-top world of Roman party tricks that would 100% get you arrested today. Imagine you're throwing a dinner party. You've got the fancy tableware out, a playlist prepared, and just as your guests settle in, the door creaks open. And in strolls the guy who wasn't invited. He's loud and hungry. He's complimenting your wine while simultaneously mocking your haircut. Now, in today's world, you'd call security. In ancient Rome, that guy was the entertainment. Meet the parasitis, not a parasite in the biological sense, but definitely a social one. His job? To show up at parties, flatter the host, roast the guests, and devour as much food as humanly possible. Think of him as a cross between a stand-up comic and a food critic with no boundaries. And here's the wildest part. People invited him on purpose. The parasitis wasn't crashing the party. He was the party. In Roman comedy, especially in plays by Plautus, he was a stock character, greedy, sycophantic, always scheming for a free meal. But beyond the stage, real-life parasiti were very much a thing. They were like human seasoning, tossed into elite banquets to spice things up with clever insults, dramatic flattery, and zero table manners. They'd praise the host like he'd just conquered Gaul while mocking other guests with passive-aggressive poetry. They were experts in walking that fine line between humor and humiliation. Just close enough to the edge to be funny, but not enough to get thrown into the street. And they didn't do it for clout or Instagram followers. They did it for food. That's the entire economic model. Jokes in, meat out. One Roman writer describes the parasitus as someone who eats with both hands, flatters with his mouth, and survives with no shame. He would endure any insult, any humiliation, for a taste of roasted boar or honey-glazed dates. Essentially, a very early version of will perform for snacks. But don't mistake him for a clown. The parasiti were very good at humor, yes, but they were improvisational roast masters who could quote philosophy, reference myth, and still find time to call a senator's wife a decorative urn with opinions. In a way, they were society's built-in satirists. Their presence reminded the wealthy and powerful not to take themselves too seriously, even if they were eating flamingo tongues off silver platters. More on that later. The parasitus was a mirror, reflecting the vanity, excess, and ridiculousness of Roman elite culture, with a wink and a wine stain. Now, try this in 2025. Show up uninvited to a dinner party, demand food, start cracking jokes about your host's job title and furniture. You won't be fed, you'll be trending on Twitter, followed by a formal trespassing charge. But back then, it was practically a dinner table sport. And here's the kicker. They had fans. Some parasiti were known by name. A few were even recurring guests at multiple banquets. It was a twisted form of celebrity, being the best at being the worst. The parasiti were known for their hunger, with some even calling them human stomachs with legs. They would clean bones, lick plates, even go for scraps other guests discarded. Picture someone hovering around the appetizer table like a hawk, except instead of wings, he's got opinions on Cicero. But perhaps the strangest part of the whole dynamic is how aware everyone was. The parasitus knew he was being used for laughs. The host knew they were being flattered for food. The guests knew they might be publicly roasted for wearing last season's toga. It was a shared performance, social theater at its weirdest, and honestly, its most honest. The parasitus didn't pretend to be anything other than what he was: hungry, shameless, and clever enough to make it work. And isn't there something almost admirable about that? Sure, today he'd be canceled, kicked out, and possibly be live tweeting his arrest. But in ancient Rome, he was a reminder that even in rooms full of gold, power, and pomposity, sometimes the funniest, hungriest guy in the room was the one making the whole thing worth watching. Of course, not all Roman party tricks involved clever wordplay. Some preferred more explosive and disgusting entertainment. Okay, let's start with the big one, the vomitorium. You've probably heard that Romans were so outrageously gluttonous, they built special rooms just to throw up in mid-party so they could eat even more. It's a juicy image: golden goblets, roasted peacocks. Unfortunately for our collective imagination, it's not true. The vomitorium, brace yourself for the least exciting answer ever, was actually an architectural term. It referred to the exit passages in Roman amphitheaters and stadiums. You know those long corridors that let crowds spew out of a venue after a show? That's literally it. The name comes from vomere, Latin for to spew forth. So it's more about crowd control than calorie control. Sorry, there's no actual puke palace at Caesar's, but don't relax just yet, because while the vomitorium was fake, the vomiting wasn't. Elite Romans had a very complicated relationship with food, specifically their ability to eat it nonstop without bursting. For them, banquets weren't about nutrition or even enjoyment. They were about power, performance, and domination via stomach capacity. Imagine a dinner party where the main goal wasn't conversation or good food, but proving that you were so rich and so powerful that you could afford to waste absolutely everything, including your own dignity. So, when they were full, and I mean button-popping, toga-straining, meat-sweat-soaked full, rich Romans at banquets and parties would just discreetly slip away, stick a feather down their throat, and reset the system. Yes, on purpose. And no, this wasn't some underground scandal. This was an accepted, if slightly gross, part of elite Roman dining culture. In fact, some sources suggest that servants may have stood by to help, as if being a human napkin wasn't demeaning enough. Now you're on standby for emergency regurgitation. It was all part of the show because Roman banquets were very much like theater. You weren't just serving food, you were serving social commentary. The more excessive the meal, the more status it conveyed. And the more food you could eat just showed you were a man of immense virtues, or at least of disturbingly elastic intestines. Yet we need to talk about the logistics of this disgusting and incredibly popular trick. A proper Roman feast or convivium could last hours. We're not talking appetizers and out. No, we're talking 5, 6, sometimes 7 courses of increasingly ridiculous foods. There was so much food that no wonder you couldn't eat all of it. Now imagine being served the whole course twice. And before you ask, yes, vomiting was considered kind of classy, especially if done with discretion. You weren't expected to yak on the tablecloth like a frat pledge. You took a dignified walk to a side area, perhaps behind a curtain or into a private garden space, gave yourself a little moment with the feather, and came back fresh as a daisy for round 3. Think of it as the Roman version of a palate cleanser, just, extreme and biologically horrifying. Now, before we judge too harshly, let's be honest. We have our own modern-day equivalents. Ever seen someone unbutton their jeans at Thanksgiving? Ever gone to an all-you-can-eat sushi buffet and prayed for a second stomach? See, the origins of Roman excess aren't entirely alien. But make no mistake, this was weaponized indulgence. This wasn't overeating because you like cake. This was overeating because the empire expects you to be impressive. Food was politics. Vomiting was performance art. Of course, not everyone loved it. The philosopher Seneca, who had the misfortune of attending several of these culinary war crimes, once wrote that he saw men who vomit so they may eat, and eat so they may vomit. That wasn't a compliment. That was Roman for these dudes are out of pocket. Seneca believed all of this gluttony was a symptom of moral decay, a warning sign that Rome had become too soft, too bloated, too obsessed with luxury. And to be fair, when your party etiquette involves planned purging between flamingo courses, he might have a point. So while the vomitorium room may not have existed, the practice of self-induced vomiting was not only real, it was disturbingly chic, a mark of wealth, indulgence, and imperial stomach dominance. And that's just the second course of Roman party culture. Ready for seconds? If you think your foodie friend who insists on eating crickets and fermented yak milk is adventurous, wait till you see what the Romans put on their party plates. We're talking flamingo tongues and stuffed dormice. Yes, actual tongues. From flamingos, Romans ate their tongue like it was the foie gras of the ancient world. The reason was that luxury in Rome wasn't about flavor, It was about flex. You didn't eat flamingo tongue because it tasted good. You ate it because it was rare, expensive, and, let's be honest, hilariously impractical. It's the ancient Roman version of someone ordering gold leaf sushi or sprinkling diamond dust on their cappuccino. It's not about the dish, it's about the drama. Still, flamingo tongues were considered a delicacy among Rome's upper crust. According to Pliny the Elder, who was basically the Yelp reviewer of antiquity, minus the star ratings, the Roman gourmet Marcus Apicius considered flamingo tongue one of the finest edible parts of the bird. Who knows why? Maybe it had a satisfying chew, or maybe they just liked the idea of eating something that sounded luxurious and impossible. Either way, imagine the logistics. You'd need dozens of flamingos to get enough tongues for a modest starter course. It's bird tapas, but way more inconvenient and cruel. But hey, status. It probably had a mix of irony and gamey taste, not unlike trying your first escargot while pretending you're fine with it. But flamingo tongues weren't even the weirdest thing on the menu. That honor goes to Glirarium dormice, plump little rodents fattened specifically for eating. That's right. Romans had dormice farms, where the tiny creatures were kept in clay jars and fed nuts until they turned into chubby, sleepy meatballs. Think of it as foie gras, but fluffier. They were then roasted, dipped in honey, stuffed with minced meat or nuts, and presented at feasts like they were tiny pigs on tiny platters. The upper class loved them. These weren't pests. They were prestige snacks. Just imagine you show up to a Roman dinner and someone hands you a tiny mouse like it's a chocolate truffle. Then someone casually says, "Oh, you must try the dormouse. It pairs beautifully with the garum sauce." Garum, by the way, is fermented fish guts. More on that another time. To a Roman host, dormice were the ultimate conversation starter. They were exotic, labor-intensive, and expensive. Eating them was like saying, "I can afford to feed you something ridiculous just because I can." The flavor? Supposedly rich, oily, nutty, and probably a bit unsettling if you've ever had a pet hamster. And let's not forget how important performative eating was in elite Roman banquets. It wasn't just what you ate, it was how loudly you chewed it. Opulence was measured in absurdity. Dishes were made to shock, surprise, and showcase just how disconnected the elite were from the concept of normal food. Today, you'd Instagram your avocado toast. In ancient Rome, you'd boast about your peacock brains and sea urchin custards. The weirder the dish, the richer you looked. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about this. Contemporary satirists roasted the upper class for these dining excesses. They mocked how the poor struggled to eat barley while the rich were washing down nightingale tongues with vintage wine older than their slaves. Still, that didn't stop the trend. In fact, entire cookbooks from the Roman world, like the one attributed to Apicius, read more like a cross between a potion manual and a dare list. What these foods show us is that partying in Rome wasn't just indulgent, it was theatrical. Every course was a plot twist. Every bite was part of a show. Food wasn't fuel, it was a power move, a personality statement, and a weirdly specific brag. So next time you think splurging on sushi is a big deal, remember? Somewhere in history, a Roman man once said, "Yes, I'll take 6 flamingo tongues and bring extra honey dormice for the table." But hey, what's a decadent Roman banquet without a little danger? Because the next trick the Romans pulled at parties wasn't on the plate. One of the most notorious party tricks in ancient Rome was essentially the entertainment of the highest caliber: nude wrestling. Yes, it was a real thing, a sort of ancient, slippery sideshow. And if you're thinking, surely this must have been part of the Olympics or some temple ritual, right? Nope. Sometimes it was just entertainment, because nothing screams refined evening of elite sophistication more than greased-up dudes grappling for glory. The Romans called it gymnos, borrowed from the Greeks, who were already very comfortable with their bodies and even more comfortable parading them in public. But while the Greeks did it for sport and maybe a little philosophical contemplation on the nature of the human form, the Romans took the idea and added flair. Imagine it. The evening is warm, the wine is flowing, and the garden is lit by flickering oil lamps. perfume hangs heavy in the air. Your host gestures toward the courtyard, and there, under the stars, two men are locked in what looks like a slippery human pretzel. Spectators lounge around the periphery, sipping wine, cracking jokes, placing bets, possibly writing poetry about glutes. All is well. Now, there was some structure to this madness. Roman wrestling wasn't a free-for-all, well, not always. They practiced styles like pankration, a blend of wrestling and boxing where basically anything went short of outright murder. Think UFC, but with fewer rules and everyone's naked and greased up like a Greek salad. And yes, oil played a big role. Athletes, and we're using the term loosely here, would coat themselves in olive oil before matches. Not just for aesthetics, though, it did give that golden shimmer. It made gripping harder, increasing the challenge. It also made slipping dramatically easier, which is either hilarious or tragic, depending on where your head hits the marble floor. There was also a ritual element. Oiling was an act of purification and celebration of the body. But let's be real, by the late Republic, it was also very much a spectacle. It was as much about showing off the human form as it was about the contest itself. And no, this wasn't happening in some dusty public gym. This was at dinner parties, garden banquets, private estates, sometimes even inside lavish villas. Wealthy patrons would hire wrestlers to perform for their guests. Others would host competitions between their household slaves or even invite enthusiastic guests to join in. You know the guy at modern parties who insists on doing shirtless push-ups after 2 beers? Now imagine that guy, but socially encouraged, covered in oil, and being cheered on by senators and poets. The audience reacted with a mix of amusement, admiration, and just the right amount of scandalized curiosity. Because, let's be real, the whole thing was sort of intimate. It was also absurd. It was competitive sports, erotic art, and social theater all wrapped in one writhing pile of muscle and sweat at a party of all places. Of course, not everyone loved it. Though we know that some writers found these displays vulgar and excessive, they never failed to write about them in great detail, which says something. Maybe the disapproval was part of the thrill. Rome loved walking the tightrope between civilization and chaos. It's also worth noting that these events blurred a lot of lines between sport and spectacle, between public and private, between appreciation and objectification. It wasn't just a party trick, it was a cultural statement, a weird, glistening, testosterone-soaked cultural statement, but still, nude wrestling at parties would not probably fly today. Unless your host is very relaxed or you're in a niche performance art circle with extremely chill neighbors. But in Rome, it was another night of flexing, socially, physically, economically. Because nothing says, I'm a man of taste and refinement, quite like organizing your own oiled wrestling night and having it discussed by your guests. So, were the Romans brilliant innovators or toga-wrapped lunatics with too much time and fermented fish sauce on their hands? Honestly, both. Their parties were outrageous, horrifying, and weirdly ingenious. Every course, every trick, every oiled-up wrestle had a purpose: to flex, to shock, to dominate through dinner. And while today we party with Spotify playlists and party hats, Romans proved one thing. History has always been a little unhinged, just more olive-oiled. So next time you think your party is out of control, at least no one's vomiting for sport. Thanks for watching.